Today we talk about the 8th chapter in my book, Apply Wit. I'm Marco Perri. Welcome to the Perri platform. Today marks the last episode in my book breakdown series. We've come to chapter 8. Next week I'm finally going to get back to talking about politics, philosophy, and my usual content, but before we get there, we have to talk about applying wit. This is the perfect chapter to tie a bow on top of all the other content because it summarizes things in a very practical fashion. Perhaps one of the criticisms that can be levied against me is that I can be very optimistic. I can portray things in a very compelling and encouraging manner, but simply having a positive outlook and believing in yourself does not guarantee a positive outcome. In fact, if you go into things blind, it's likely you will encounter further turmoil. So you need something to balance the scales here, a medium to navigate these pillars effectively. The first thing I want to establish is that the previous pillars that I've laid out are not dogmas. They're not religious texts that cannot be altered and you have to take them at face value. In fact, it's the opposite. I want them to be flexible. I want you to interpret them and find ways to mold the meaning to suit your individual circumstances. Nothing I've said is absolute. It's all malleable. Your situation will change, your values will evolve, you'll get older, you'll learn things, but keep in mind the core tenet of what I've tried to explain to you. The notion of setting up meaning for yourself, of trying to own the moments and things like that. The ways in which I've talked about them, you can interpret that however you want. You can manifest a pillar in different ways, but the main idea there, that's really what I wanted to hit home at. Everything else you can try and figure out how you want to apply that for yourself. And further, if the pillar doesn't apply to you, if you've already mastered it, if you see no worth in it, that's fine as well. See, really, ideas are like tools, and what I've tried to do is provide you with some more. You have a toolbox, and in life you're going to encounter a variety of problems. You'll need certain tools to tackle them. A hammer can do this, a wrench can do that. Adding these 8 pillars that I've talked and written about into your arsenal can hopefully provide you additional insights and different avenues that you can go down and lead you to productive outcomes and ends when you're dealing with the many issues that you're bound to encounter. Now, since ideas are like tools, very similarly in terms of function, there are different ways you can use them. So, with a knife, you can cut an apple or you can stab someone. With a hammer, you can put a nail into a piece of wood and you can take it out. This interpretation is up to you, and I do implore you to be wise, to apply wit, to make sure that the ideas you have are first of all good, and second, being used in a good way. And I don't think that breaks down to be 50-50. Half of the decision criteria is based on the idea being good, and the other half is based on the application. I think there is more weight on the application actually, very similar to a knife. Is a knife good? Is it bad? Well, it depends on how you use that tool. If you are using it just to cut your apple into slices, that's fine. But if you're using it to inflict harm upon people, then that's bad. It isn't an indictment on the tool itself, but just the way the application is being put forward, the ways in which you use it. Be aware of that. Now, based on that preamble, you probably are getting at what this chapter was meant to do. It was meant to encourage you to reflect on the previous chapters, to be critical of them, and to see where things can go wrong. They're not perfect, they're not as flexible as I'd want them to be, and that's pretty impossible to do when you're writing something down in text. Your situation is going to change, the world is going to evolve and whatnot, so you have to apply wit. You have to use your wisdom, combine it with the tools you've been given to find out the best ways to use them. And I think any good thinker should be doing this with all of their tools. So, let's begin. At the beginning of the book, we talked about guts over fear. The importance of not letting fear dominate your life and try to take control of the emotions at play there. Now, of course, I'm not saying to rush gung-ho into every situation. I'm not saying to needlessly put yourself in danger to prove that you are brave. You have to be smart here. Apply wit. Differentiate between the situations where you can in fact display courage and the ones where it's smarter for you to not. You can probably get some rough estimation and some insights based on the probable outcome. If the situation has the potential to seriously harm you, seriously harm those around yourself, or perhaps to kill you, then probably it's better to just leave and not go down the guts over fear route. Perhaps fear has a good point in the situation. For example, let's say that you encounter an individual who has a weapon on them and they're asking you or demanding that you provide them your wallet, that you give them your phone, your money, your jewelry, whatever. If you did exactly as laid out in the text like a dogma, guts over fear, you might lead yourself to believe that you should fight this person, not give in to their demands, and try and punch them, even though they have a gun or something like that. That's not wise. In the situation, fear has a good point here, and keep in mind the root of fear too. It's meant to keep you alive fundamentally. In a situation like that, listen to it and just comply. When it's appropriate to display guts over fear, the situation will not result in your demise if things go wrong, like public speaking or developing a skill that you want, or asking somebody out, pursuing a career down a path that you desire. These things are all fine, so quantify it in terms of the actual harm that can manifest. And if you feel like rejection or something is as deadly as encountering someone with a weapon, then calibrate your senses, because that's common. We can overestimate the harms that can come from acting bravely, and sometimes too we can underestimate it. You have to apply wit to make sure that is balanced at all times. Then we had the second pillar, own the moments. This was meant to encourage individuals to actually live a little bit, to produce memories that will be able to be looked back upon fondly. Instead, nowadays we see a lot of people who are living vicariously through their phone, through another individual, through a celebrity, and they're not really taking the time to cultivate for themselves memories and experiences that are worthwhile. Now, here's the danger with that. You don't want to live in the moment for too long. There is such a thing as being caught and no longer advancing with the waves of time. We see that with people who have, ironically, you could say, peaked early. They continue to reflect on something that happened a very long time ago, and that's the highlight for them. They continue to relive it and retell it, and it halts them from creating new moments. They can't own anything further because they've decided this here is the pinnacle. And nothing could be further from the truth. In this world, there's infinite potential and possibilities. That is 100% true. You have to embrace that. Enjoy the moments while you can. They're fleeting by nature. Trying to cement them and live in them permanently is doing no good for you or for your future prospects, so be aware of that. Then we have the third pillar, which is develop a light heart. This is meant to encourage you to brush off some of the lesser hardships of life so you don't get too bogged down. Now, that could be misinterpreted to say brush off everything, to not care about anything, and to take a stoic perspective towards every misfortune that comes your way. And that's not what I'm saying here. In fact, I differentiated the two types of suffering. There's the kind that can be ignored and the kind that has to be recognized. The next pillar talks about the latter. So just keep in mind, it's not worth it to try and rid yourself of all suffering. That's not the point of the pillar. It's to brush off as quickly as you can the things that are not worth holding on to. The only outcome here is you end up bogging yourself down. You end up developing a form of resentment that will carry throughout all your future encounters, and you don't need that. Then, the next pillar, bouncing back. Here's where we deal with that suffering that is very hard to let go of. It's immense, and everyone's going to encounter that. For something like this, you have to take your time to mourn and bounce back. Don't try to rush it, though. Bouncing back, you don't have to think that it's a fast process like a ball. That's the metaphor that I use, bouncing down and up, losing energy. The ball does it instantaneously, but you have to remain at the bottom for a little bit. You will bounce up. Think of it like a spring instead. You're at the bottom, you have to recharge, gather your energy, and when you've compressed enough, then you can bounce back up. Don't rush it. Take your time. Then we have the following pillar, which is finding and being yourself. Here you have to be careful about getting the wrong formula. It's very common for individuals to idolize a celebrity or an athlete, someone they admire, and to try and make themselves fit into that mold. Now, it's okay to do that and take traits you like and apply that to yourself, but to have the mission of becoming this individual, that's the wrong thing to do. And if you mix that notion with the pillar of finding and being yourself, the end result is going to be something that doesn't work out. It's going to be you trying to fit into a formula, or picture yourself being a rectangular block and you're trying to put yourself into a square hole. It wouldn't work out, or a circular hole. It just doesn't fit. It's not you. You have to take your time here and really figure out what makes you the individual that you are. And you can mold that further by taking what you are and projecting onto it a desire for a better you in the future. And you can use those traits from other individuals who you idolize, but don't try to make yourself them per se. It's the wrong approach here. Then we have discovering a purpose. Probably the biggest thing to keep in mind here is that your purpose has to be arrived at via some form of thinking. It cannot be given to you because it's not yours. To have someone prescribe it to you will not get you there, to the end goal that you desire. At the same time, if you choose for yourself a purpose that really isn't that concrete, like trying to break the record for most cigarettes smoked in a day or something like that, there are purposes that are not that fulfilling, not that wholesome, and you have to apply logic here. Just because you picked something doesn't mean it's good. Kind of like the tools we talked about. Apply wit to make sure that what you're picking is good and you're using it towards a good end. If there's a deficiency there, think about it and you have to pivot. Then for the 7th pillar, we have cultivate love. Here, we talked about it last week. You have to be wise about that as well. You can't put up with abuse and neglect just because you're trying to preserve a loving attitude. You cannot set yourself on fire to provide warmth for other people because you will burn out. And there are different levels of love as well. So there's a baseline that should be granted to all of humanity, recognizing their worth, not inflicting needless pain upon them. And there's a level beyond that that you typically reserve for family, friends, people who you actually like and whatnot. To try and put the latter into the former, it takes a really big person to be capable of that. And you have to be wise. If you cannot do that, stick to the baseline, especially if you are vulnerable to certain types of betrayal and whatnot. A wise person will provide the baseline level of love to all humans. They will not harbor hate for anyone. But when it comes to going that level beyond, make sure that the individuals who you entrust with that are worthy. Because the greater the love you provide, the greater the potential that you can be harmed. And that's just the facts of the matter. So be smart in that pursuit. And then, of course, we have applying wit, the 8th pillar, which is about doing what we've talked about. Questioning the things you've been given. Trying to figure out how to best use the tools you have in your box and creating the best outcomes for yourself possible. Being able to pivot. Using what you've learned to give yourself a better roadmap for the future. And with that, it summarizes the entirety of my book. To conclude though, at the end of it, I did put some quotes in there that could provide some inspiration to people or give them some food for thought. So I want to end off by just going through that for the last half of the episode. So, the first quote we have here is by Fyodor Dostoevsky, coming from the Brothers Karamazov, pretty popular book. He says this: above all, don't lie to yourself. The man who lies to himself and listens to his own lie comes to a point that he cannot distinguish between the truth within him or around him, and so loses all respect for himself and for others, and having no respect, he ceases to love. So what does that mean? Fundamentally, I think the first message here is that the hardest person to lie to and to actually fool is yourself. Other individuals, that's not really that difficult. You can get away with it, but to trick your own conscience, that takes a lot of work, and it's not worth going down that path. Why? Because if you're actually able to trick yourself into believing the lies you constantly tell yourself, you lose a certain ability. Your mind is constantly battling you, holding the truth in one regard and the lies in the other. If you continue to tell yourself that the truth is wrong and the lies are actually what is reality, your mind might shift to that. And then you get to a point where you can actually no longer distinguish between what is true and what's not. And you can see that a lot. People who are telling you things that are blatantly false, but for some reason, they've internalized the belief into them. It's gospel now. And then, what happens after that? Your mind can no longer differentiate. You lose the ability to tell what's true and what's not. And further, you're going to lose respect for yourself because there'll still be a part of you lingering there, that knows what happened. Instead of facing the realities of the world bravely, you decide to hide behind a lie. And what happens after that? Because you've done this to yourself, you lose respect and you cease to love. Why is that? Well, if you think about it from a foundational standpoint, if you build your relationship based on lies and falsehoods, that's not a strong structure. It can easily be toppled over. And how can you love what you've created here when you know it's a falsehood? The only alternative, really, is to try your best to stick to the path of truth, to be brave in the face of the world that encourages you to tell lies. Now, there may be situations where you do have to lie to other people, and one example that I can think of right away is in Nazi Germany. If the soldiers come to your house and they ask you, "Are you hiding someone here?" you might have to lie to them to save the individual. But do not lie to yourself. Don't find a way to trick yourself into thinking that there really isn't anyone here, you're not doing anything crazy. You are taking a major risk, actually, but it's a good one. Keep the truth to yourself. Internally, at least once you extinguish that fire, there is no turning back. And if you're able to muster the courage, tell the truth to other people as well. That's the next step. But fundamentally, above all, as Dostoevsky says, do not lie to yourself. Now, the next quote we have here also comes from that same book, actually, the Brothers Karamazov. It says, "The mystery of human existence lies not in just staying alive, but in finding something to live for." That's pretty deep, and it touches on one of the previous pillars. So, in this world, there are animals, which humans are actually a part of that group, but you have humans too. Kind of different. All other animals here are given a purpose to survive, to build a den, to lay eggs, whatever it is, it's biologically engineered into them. They know right away. There is no thinking that goes on here. It's just automatic, it's instinct, and they know what they have to do. You could say that at a baseline level, the purpose of many of these animals is to stay alive and propagate, to further their genetic line. But when it comes to humans, though, that's not the answer to the mystery of existence. Actually, it's different. It's something more than that. As a human, if all you were doing was simply trying to stay alive, I assume you'd be best off hiding under a rock and doing the bare minimum, not expanding too much energy, not having fun, not traveling because there is an increased risk of dying by moving around in a plane or a car or whatever. But we don't act that way. There is something more here. In fact, as a human, you're called to figure that out for yourself, finding something to live for. That's your duty and your journey and your responsibility to individually interpret what life can mean for you. And that is quite the burden. Animals don't have to deal with that. But as humans, we do have that higher intellect, and as a result, we have more responsibility to look beyond the given, the biological impulses, and to discover for yourself what really is here. What is there that's meant for you? What can provide you that purpose to endure anyhow? What is your why? Figure it out, because that's what you have to do. Then we have the next quote here, which comes from Tolkien. He's the author of The Lord of the Rings. He says that someone else always has to carry on the story. That's true. See, in the grand scheme of things, we are but a blip. Our generation, or however you want to quantify it, is only around for a small proportion of the human existence story. And the next iteration, the next chapter, has to be carried on by somebody else. So, fundamentally, if you cannot figure out a more unique purpose for yourself, here's one that makes sense. Try not to leave behind a better world than the one you inherited, because the future generation has to carry on the story. The story actually does not end. Well, at some point it might, but just because yours doesn't mean the grander narrative will. In fact, it's a continuation. It's the story of human progress, trying to contribute to that. That's a positive thing to do. In fact, it's quite motivational, and I think that could be a purpose in and of itself. Trying to make that grander story even a little bit better. That the next generation, maybe even your direct bloodline, has it a little bit better off than they would have if you did nothing. That's a positive step in terms of securing the future for humanity. And it's the same mindset that brought you to where you are today. If nobody gave a thought about the future, why would they spend 20 years of their life studying science and trying to find a breakthrough that they wouldn't be able to experience themselves? Many of these people who were innovating before, they weren't innovating simply because they wanted the item. They wanted to change the world, to make it better for humanity, which involves you. We are currently living in the most technologically advanced times ever. To have a smartphone, a computer, to be able to listen to this podcast very easily, these were gifts that were given to us by other people because they knew someone else has to carry on the story. They didn't make it simply for themselves. This here is a grander tale about everyone, collectively. Next, I have a quote from George R.R. Martin, the author of Game of Thrones. He says, "Can a man still be brave if he's afraid? Well, that is the only time a man can be brave." So there's a lesson there. First of all, you should actually not feel bad about being afraid. It's natural, and that you actually cannot control. You will feel the emotion. But at the same time, there's an opportunity there. It's that mixture of chaos and the known world. Chaos and order. Within this realm of chaos here, you can extract order from it. Because you feel afraid, you feel shocked and whatnot, it doesn't mean you're paralyzed. It actually presents you the opportunity to be paralyzed or to be brave, because that's the only time you can actually be it. You can think of it as a prerequisite. It's nasty, it's negative, it bogs you down, but you need it to actually grow. You need it to be brave, because you cannot be brave if you're not afraid. It doesn't work like that. If you're not afraid, there's nothing to be brave about. This is something to be regarded as an opportunity. Try and think about that the next time you're afraid. Frame it in this way and see what happens to you. Now, I really like this next one here. It comes from the author of the Witcher series. I have a very hard time pronouncing his name, but I'll try. Andrzej Sapkowski. Hopefully I didn't butcher that too hard, but the quote goes like this. "People like to invent monsters and monstrosities. Then, they seem less monstrous themselves when they get blind drunk. They cheat, steal, beat their wives, starve an old woman. When they kill a trapped fox with an axe or riddle the last existing unicorn with arrows, they like to think that the Bane entering cottages at daybreak is more monstrous than they are. They feel better. They find it easier to live." And this is a very deep quote. There's a lot of breaking down that has to be done here to extract all the meaning, but you can start by understanding this here. As individuals, we often underestimate just how bad we either are or how bad we can be. And when another person is exhibiting behaviors that we would consider malevolent, it's easy to cast them as a monster because it makes us feel better that we are not them. But here's the catch here. You guys are both human. You guys are both people. You have that in common. If this monstrosity could manifest in them, what makes it not manifest in you? And if you don't have an answer to that, it's very likely it could manifest in you because you haven't thought about it. You've not figured out a proper defense mechanism to guard yourself from that possibility. At a fundamental level, we actually are all monsters, and if that hasn't manifested, there is one inside of us. There's very few people who are free from that constraint, who are free from the chains of monstrosity within them. And if you see an individual who is trying their best to stay away from that, to stave off the callings of that monster within, they're doing a good job, and I would recommend not judging them too harshly. Because if situations were different, if you were in their shoes, would you have acted any different? And I give the example of Nazi Germany to highlight this. It's very easy for us to say, these soldiers were monsters. We would never be like them. And the funny thing is, if you took that soldier and you put them in your shoes, I'm sure they would be saying the same thing. And if you were in their shoes over in Germany during the Holocaust, you might be singing a different tune. The masses gave into that because of propaganda, appealing to the worst of humanity within you, and a lot of them gave in. What makes you so special that you would resist that? Statistically, it's unlikely you would. So keep that in mind. Then the next quote I have is from Frank Herbert. He's the author of Dune. He says that the mystery of life isn't a problem to solve, but a reality to experience. And all I'll say about this is that For thousands of years, humans have debated about this notion, the mystery of life, and they have not been able to solve it. Period. There are different interpretations. There is the religious context, the scientific one, the rationalist, however you want to view it, the philosophical. None of these can be proved, though. There isn't a solution per se, that you can believe in one, but you have to acknowledge that it's probably a faith-based argument at best. Now, if you take that inquiry, this mystery of life problem, and instead of trying to deduce it theoretically, instead you experience it, you may find your answer actually. Perhaps the mystery of life can be touched by the things you do, by living a virtuous lifestyle, by maybe, if we're lucky and I wrote the right things down, sticking to the 8 pillars to live by. Maybe these things can evoke feelings within you, or emotions or insights that give you a glimpse at it. And maybe we can't put it into words here, but I'm sure you can relate. By doing something that really engages you, time goes by very fast, you don't even notice it. And when you're doing something boring, that does not bring you to life, time goes by very slowly. Perhaps when we are doing these things that accelerate the motion of time, we are touching the mystery of life in that regard. And probably there are many other examples too. Instead of quibbling and debating about the exact answer as if it's a problem to solve, maybe the world will be better if we all try to individually experience it as a shared reality. That's some food for thought there. Then we move on to a quote by Jordan B. Peterson, the author of 12 Rules for Life, and he says that when you have something to say, silence is a lie. This touches on a variety of topics, and one of them is bravery again. If you have something to say, but you are too scared to do it because you feel like you will be ostracized or whatnot because it doesn't fit the popular rhetoric of the day, silence is in fact a lie because you have betrayed yourself now. And it's funny too, because silence is more dangerous than you can imagine. Think about all of these dystopian regimes, or perhaps not dystopian, but authoritarian, of the past. They all started somewhere by one individual getting people to join on board to a bad idea. Now, the bystanders may have had issues with it, but they never said anything, and it was allowed to snowball. If there is something that calls you to say something about it, if you have an argument or an idea, say it. Silence is a lie, and it's more dangerous than you can imagine. The state of the world is in flux, and it's easy to shake things up. If you have an opinion about something, let's hear it. You doing that could be the piece of thread that keeps things together. You could convince individuals to join your side of the argument if you think it's right. Don't be afraid. Let's hear it. You have that right, at least here in Canada and in America. Talk about it and try to be civilized while you do it at the same time. That's a big issue that we'll talk about more in the future, I'm sure. Now, finally, the last quote I want to talk about is from George Orwell, the author of 1984. He says that doublethink means the power of holding two contradictory beliefs in one's mind simultaneously, and accepting both of them. Now, this really is a self-reflection type of quote. Almost everyone has some form of logical fallacy within their thinking. Try to identify that within yourself. It will make you a better person. If you have these contradictory ideas but you're holding them together, even though they cannot match, try and root that out. If you have perhaps an idea that you have internalized without critically analyzing it, think about that. There's a lot of misinformation and propaganda and nonsense out there today, and if we as individuals could better ourselves, it would have less of an effect. Propaganda, fake news, it only is effective against the individual that is uninformed, if you are vulnerable to it. If you could take a second to learn about things to actually better your mind, you'd be in a far better position, and if we could all do that, the country would be in a better position. If the whole world could do that, the entire world would be in a better position. It's a challenge though. Trying to untangle the mess that can be your thinking process, it takes time, it takes effort, and you might have to figure out how to even do that. It might not be obvious to you how to go about that journey, but there are resources available to you, and I suggest you look at them. One area where you can begin doing this is by hearing opposing sides to an argument, not trapping yourself in an echo chamber. That's like a breeding ground for fallacies like doublethink. So Perhaps this is most in line with the 8th pillar, applying wit. Try to gain wisdom and apply it to yourself, and you'll be in a far better place for doing so. And with those words, we've concluded the book breakdown series. Those are all the chapters in Attaining Fulfillment, 8 Pillars to Live By. Once again, I will reiterate, the book is free online everywhere. Amazon, Apple, any place where you can get ebooks, you can find mine. And if you can't get it from one of those retailers for whatever reason, shoot me a message and I'll make sure you get it. Now, next week we'll be back to our regular programming, philosophy, debates, and politics, and whatever else I want to talk about. I haven't chosen a topic yet, so if you have an idea, something you want to hear me talk about, I know we've been focused on this for the past 2 months and we've been kind of out of the loop. If there's something you want to hear my thoughts on, shoot me an email or a message and I'll try to address that. So, without further ado, thanks for joining me. It's been a pleasure.